Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of our Athena Hackathon webinars. Very excited to be joined by Simon Chatterjee from Cisco. I'll just let Peter in. I'll kind of be on hand to help out throughout. I think if you have any questions, let us know in the YouTube chat. As ever, if you've watched these before, we'll be available on Discord and things throughout as well. So don't worry too much if you can't think of anything at the minute. We can always answer stuff retrospectively. But I'll stop rambling on. I'll pass over to Simon and let us know if you have any questions in the chat.
Thanks, Alex. I'm very proud to be here to support Athena Hack. It's a bit conspicuous me not being a woman, and I work with many brilliant women engineers and technologists, but some last-minute scheduling meant it ended up me being here. But we'll do the best. So quick introductions. So you haven't heard of Cisco. It's probably the world's leading computer networking company. The mission is power and inclusive future for all. And my particular team, which is based just outside of London, has around 70 software engineers, and we develop technology that goes in the world's biggest networks. So if you imagine a big computer company is one of them, and helping build out the internet for everyone. And pretty much wherever you are, you'll be watching, the stream you're watching will be running over our code somewhere. It's pretty much ubiquitous. So the title is How to Break the Internet. And what do I mean by that? Well, I guess in broader culture, I guess people like Kim Kardashian were normally credited with breaking the internet in kind of a social sense. But that's not really what I'm talking about here. Things like outages you see moderately regularly, where something like a content delivery network goes down and takes out some number of sites, is getting a little bit closer, but still that's just really one part of the internet. Some bigger stories where like big fractions of the internet go down for some fraction is getting closer to what I mean. These sort of stories are often things like, in this case, what's called a distributed denial of service attack, which we'll talk about in a moment, attacking the domain name service, which is the part of the internet that turns domain names like cisco.com into a numeric address for the network, was attacked. And this sort of attack is surprisingly common. It's often come from Internet of Things devices like baby monitors and doorbells, where they're out on the internet, they have insecure default credentials that nobody changes. And so in an automated way, the bad people can scan the internet, find these things, take them over, and then assemble an army of zombies where even if each individual one can only produce a weedy amount of impact on the internet, if you get enough of them in aggregate and put them in one place, then the implosion that happens there can still be overwhelming. And if you go to the dark places on the internet, you can find sites where you can rent these for hire. They have nice user interfaces. Once you've paid for your attack, you can give it stars out of 5 and recommend it and get a discount coupon for next time. It's a very kind of well-oiled industry. You don't have to be technical to deploy it. But this is kind of raising a bit of a conundrum. Let me just show you actually. So, I'm not sure if this will share. I may have done the sharing wrong. But this was actually a snapshot I took this morning for one measurement of attacks going on the internet right now. And here you can see that there are significant attacks going on into Brazil, the United States, and Thailand. But this raises if you look at one particular site, so this is, for example, from GitHub, where they were subject to one such attack. So here, this is their traffic statistic trundling across time, and then suddenly there's more than a terabit per second coming in, and this actually took them out for a few minutes before they managed to mitigate that. I think probably the biggest one that's been publicly announced to date is this one from Microsoft Azure, where it's almost 3.5 terabits per second, again, coming into one place that they was able to mitigate. And so this raises a bit of a conundrum. So the internet, the underlying technology of packet-based networks, was designed in an environment of fearing for nuclear war, and it was a technology designed to be as resilient as possible. So the core technology is there to withstand nuclear attacks effectively for whatever's left. But is this kind of super resilient technology subject to be brought to its knees by internet-connected toasters? Right? How does this really all make sense? So it's this sense of internet robustness I want to talk about. Now, how would you secure the internet? Well, it could mean loads of things. A few basic things. Well, outage resistance. So if you send something to the net, it should get there. Tamper resistant. So if it got there, nobody messed with it maliciously. Or snoop resistant. If you didn't want someone to see it on its way, then they didn't invisibly observe that. But even these modest goals actually cover a massive engineering scope. So I'm going to focus here now on essentially how easy is it to mess with someone else's core router from across the internet. And I'll explain what that is in a moment. And I'm deliberately using any particular references that are quite old to make sure that I'm not talking about anything confidential. So this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about how you build the internet, so you know how to break it. Talk about the physical infrastructure, where many people just imagine the internet as kind of sort of ethereally ambient, but it's made of real stuff. We need to see what that is. And then address this question: well, how indestructible can we make the big machines that power it, that run our software? And then we'll talk a bit about some past disasters and what we can learn from that. So if you were here for the Kim Kardashian bit, I'm afraid you may be in the wrong talk. So how do you build the internet? Well, the internet is kind of an any-to-any connectivity problem. Right? So the idea is you could turn up, say, with your phone anywhere on the internet and access a server or anyone else or a peer device, and it will connect it up. And there's several ways you could engineer that. If you think about moving physical goods, one model could be the railways, where you have these linear tracks, and once you point the train on the tracks, it's really, really efficient to just follow those and follow that. The problem with that is if there's a problem with the tracks, you may be stuck. You may have maybe one backup if you could switch, but if you break both of those, it's probably you're probably out of luck. So it's super efficient, but not very robust. Indeed, this is how the phone system was originally engineered, and indeed we see that kind of characteristics. Our alternative approach is more to break the information up into small packets and then send them out across the network and have each packet essentially navigate its way individually. So imagine if it's on a bike, then at each junction, a judgment happens about which way to go to advance further to the eventual destination. And if there's a roadblock, well, then there and then can make a tactical decision to go around it if there is a way around it. And so this involves a lot more computation across the network to get the data from one to the other. But the upside is, if there's something going wrong, then if there's a way around it, it will follow it. And that's really the foundation of the internet. Now, even having made that decision, I think, well, how are we going to what are the roads, what are the paths this data can follow down? And again, if you look at any to-any connectivity problem, like the postal service or the veins in your arm, or this picture here, the veins in a leaf. If you imagine like your every cell in your body needs access to glucose and oxygen, but you couldn't have a capillary going from your heart and lungs to every cell individually. It wouldn't fit volumetrically. So you have these arterioles and arteries, this hierarchy. And this is indeed why the cheapest way to send like a postcard ends up being packing jumbo jets full of post across oceans, right? You aggregate up. And indeed, that's the only way to build it. And that's how the internet is. So if you want to build a global network, or indeed any big network, one part is you end up, rather than having lots of small sort of channels for the stuff to flow through, you aggregate up into a few backbone links that are essentially as fast as money can buy. This is partly why it's such a great engineering job to be in, because if you imagine, say, we need more capacity between London and Edinburgh, if your options are either A, dig another trench from London to Edinburgh and lay more fibre, or B, deploy the fanciest technology we know how to make to get more out of what's there, well, the second is always cheaper. So we get to essentially deploy the most advanced technology that we know how to build because it's always cheaper. And the other thing to bear in mind is, even though the kind of everyday consumer experience of these global networks is a commodity internet access. So you turn on your phone, you access some websites and send some email, and if it doesn't work, well, you try again in a minute. The same networks are doing many more critical things as well. They're hosting telepresence calls between world leaders. They're hosting railway signaling. They're hosting like blue light services for like first responders in the UK. And so all those services are much more pernickety and require much more processing per packet than you build the network once to run all those things. So you need to do a lot of processing per packet to be able to manage that. So what does kind of if you imagine one core network, so here's a picture of Janet, which is the UK academic network from a few years ago. And these two pictures are, as they say, topologically homomorphic. They're the same picture, just drawn differently. And you can see with kind of the blue lines, there's kind of a solid core, a connected core of fast links, where you can imagine slicing through any one or two or maybe three of these, and the core remains self-connected. But then as you go towards the edges, any area, geography within that was aggregating all the educational establishments in a particular area, becomes singly connected. And that's just because that's the cheapest way to do it. And if, say, you had something like a big physics experiment somewhere where it really needed resilient access, even if, for example, Janet went down, well, then it would pay for a second access link to a second network with a separate core to get that redundancy. And here's another example. This is a US network. And you see, even though the US is a much more vast country, both geographically and in data terms than the UK, it kind of looks similar. Right? You have a couple of dozen, as I say, NFL cities, and then these links between them, and that forms the core of the network. And any one of these red lines here represents some right of way, like a railroad track or something, where there's conduit, and then the conduit of optical fibers. You'd have many fibers, and on one fiber, you can shine up to 80 colors of light down it in a little bit of bandwidth where you know to amplify efficiently. Then any one of those colors, these are all infrared colors, carries data at 100 gigabits per second or moving up to 400 gigabits per second. So there's many, many terabits per second flowing through any one of these links. So which we'd expect, because imagine one point in the network is aggregating a huge area of both individual humans who might connect to the internet, and also potentially data centers and other things that connect from the machine side. And so that's any one network like Janet or Comcast or whatever that have a particular mission, be that for profit or for educational mission or whatever it is. And then the magic of the internet design is, well, anything on the internet ends up having a unique name, and they glue together in such a way that you get this sort of patchwork quilt that connects together and encircles the globe, and we get the whole internet. And the joins at these points, where links come together and packet by packet, a decision gets made as to which way to send the packets. That's done by something called routers or routers, and I may say either. I work a lot with Americans. And back when I started this gig, I mean, my mum had no idea what a router was. And then when she got some more internet, she knew what a router was. It's a little plastic box, sort of about that big, that she turned off and on again for no apparent reason, like once a month. That's not quite what we mean by a router at these points of the network. They kind of look much more imposing. Like these ones here, for example, about as tall as I am. But a typical modern one looks a bit like this. This is the front. It's about 1 meter tall. And each one of these little rectangular holes you can see that's about the size of a stick of gum. That takes an optics module where you have the lasers and all the receiving circuitry to send packets in and out along an optical signal at 400 gigabits per second in and out. So you can see any one of these like sort of pizza box slice things, they're called line cards, has many terabits per second of packets flowing in and out all the time. And you add them all up and you get a big system. You also get a bit of general compute to help it all together, the redundant pair of what we call ramp processors. And everything here, our CPUs, everything is running tens of millions of lines of our software to make it all work. And if you look kind of sort of schematically at what's going on, well, each of these kind of things with holes in for the optics is what's called a line card, and they connect over a thing called switch fabric, which is a clever bit of silicon that means you can have packets flowing from anywhere to anywhere within the device, and it all kind of works at once. And it's kind of the embedded device that's running, let's say, software. Now you might think, why do you bother? What's so hard about forwarding packets? Can't you just like get a server and write some software? Well, no. And one sort of way of looking at it should be obvious. I mean, this could be sitting next to an entire data center where you could have hundreds of thousands of top-end servers connecting to the internet, and all that traffic is flowing through some small number of these devices, right? So, and the servers are going as fast as they can. So you've got 100,000 of those. It can't go into one of those of the same thing. You need something qualitatively different. So even though in principle, the basic thing of route traffic, which when packets come in, figure out where they're going and where's the best way to send them so they're one hop further on to their end destination. Doing that quickly enough would be hard enough, impossible to do for, like, for example, a massive server farm or a massive area of people looking at the internet. But as I mentioned before, it's not just doing commodity internet stuff. It's also looking at the many other types of traffic where people are paying more for a particular type of service and need to differentiate. So, for example, if you're running voice traffic, well, that you don't want to low throughput telepresence, you could be doing lots of processing for packet for either residential security or enterprise security. And so essentially you need to run quite a substantially big program per packet to figure out what to do with it. At the same time as they come in at this mind-droppingly high rate, that's way faster than a commodity CPU could ever handle. So there's, just to give you a flavor of how we kind of square that, part of the game of what we can do or have to do essentially is redefine what a computer is. So we're still running software, but rather than just taking a CPU off the shelf that someone made equally as well for running, say, Microsoft Word or Spotify as forwarding packets, we need to optimize the transistors around our particular use case. So one example, is to give a flavor, is the technology called a TCAM, which is a ternary content-addressable memory. And the idea is, suppose a packet comes in, you need to extract out fields from the packet header, like where it's going and what sort of packet it is. And maybe you have to run, say, a 100,000 line program to decide what to do with it. You do this packet by packet as they come in. Well, if you do that sequentially with a regular CPU, that would just take way too long. So instead, what we can do is redefine this combination of CPU and memory into a new kind of chip, where we have sort of half of its memory and half of it is like a little baby CPU sprayed out across each memory line. And so when a packet comes in, we have a key that we're going to load up, and then there's a match criteria that's essentially our 100,000 line program, but laid out, stamped out in the chip in transient memory. And so when a packet comes in, well, the hardware extracts out all the fields of the packet that we care about, loads them in simultaneously to all these rows, and then simultaneously, we have a computation for each row, effectively for each match criterion you could apply to the packet with a tiny little, effectively CPU core or logic core. Find out which ones match, and then kind of priori encode which one we're going to act on. And that way, you can effectively run your 100,000 line program like in one clock cycle. There are lots of constraints, right? But that's one sort of example of how you're still running software, but we're rearranging the transistors in a form that makes the task in front of us achievable. So fine, so we have these huge devices. They take many, many terabits per second of traffic flowing in all the time. It's sitting out there on the internet, right? It's sitting there alone, right? There's no firewall you could put in front of it because it's faster than a firewall. You can't protect it. It has to stand by itself. Suppose you did manage to, as I say, pwn it, so attack it, hack it, gain control of it, and have nefarious ends in mind. Well, one thing you could do is we could what we call black hole traffic. So if you think, I don't want, for example, traffic to let's say Ukraine High Command, for example, to get through, you could just cause it to drop it. You could divert that traffic somewhere else if you want to say, I want to see what that is. You could take a copy of the traffic and send it somewhere. There is a feature that lets you do this that's required for law enforcement to be able to intercept things like phone calls. And this has happened with phone switches, where, for example, nefarious people have hacked phone switches and used this capability to invisibly spy on other phone calls. This was a while ago, but it has happened in that context. You could also just direct vast amounts of traffic at a particular target if you wanted to denial of service attacking, and so on. So these are powerful devices. This is the guts of the internet, and if you could sort of control it, you have a lot of power there. So we really don't want that to happen. So that's, you have a mental model now how you build the internet. Big long links, huge routers in the middle that control it, and at the edge people connect. Now let's talk about the physical stuff a bit, and I'll start with a puzzle. So what do these three things have in common? A graduate student called Sean, Osama bin Laden, and a chainsaw. I'll skip to the answer because it's not good format for interactivity. But the answer is, so back when the war on terror was kind of in its early days, this PhD student, Sean Gorman, wanted to know, well, if I were Osama bin Laden, what would I attack in the internet? So he looked up lots of publicly available information in the United States about where fiber conduit was, where like network equipment lay, and mapped out what US industries like chemical plants or everything were plotting and using it. And basically ran the mathematical experiment of, okay, if I had effectively one bomb, where should I plant it for maximal destruction? And he did his PhD thesis and was just about to go and defend it and finally get his PhD awarded when the Department of Homeland Security stepped in and said, that's become top secret, even though you've merely aggregated a large amount of totally public open source information, because now you're essentially posing a threat to security. So they requested that in the end he managed to graduate. I think originally they asked that he never be able to read his thesis, but whatever, he went on to found a successful security company. But there's your question. This stuff is there in the ground. How resilient is it? Well, let's take a look. So there have been, even since the days of the telegraph, which is where this map comes from. This is a 19th century map, I think, or early 20th century, of long lines for telegraphs. That's like Morse code tapped out with just ones and zeros. And if you look at kind of a modern like internet map for submarine optical fiber cables, it looks kind of similar. Just we have a lot more of it now. And as I say, one telegraph line used to carry like one set of Morse code speed ones and zeros. One undersea cable, say, is an armored cable that carries many optical fibers. Each fiber can carry many colors of light, all in the infrared, and one color of light can carry, say, 100 gigabits or up to 400 gigabits per second of traffic. So each one has a lot of traffic, but still, it's the same deal. One thing you might observe is it's gradually becoming much more equitable. Like, for example, having good fiber access around Africa is something that took a while to happen, but now is happening quite strongly. And if you here's the UK, and you can see, for example, there's a huge amount of fiber going across the Atlantic towards the States and also to mainland continental Europe. And it all kind of comes in around here in the southwest corner, which is the same place the telegraph cables came, because it's the closest point to America. You might think, well, isn't the backbone issue? If you, for example, had a bomb and placed it near that point in Cornwall, wouldn't that take out a lot of fiber? The answer is yes, it would. So you're starting to get other alternatives like this one here, the green one, that lands because it's transatlantic but landing in a different part of the UK, but they're more expensive and people don't tend to use them. So that's all the challenge. So let's say these cables, they're armored cables that have within them these tiny strands of glass to carry terabits per second of traffic. And they're kind of really remarkable engineering efforts in their own right. They have, you have copper going back down it to power not the optical fibers themselves, but amplifiers, we'll say at the moment. There's only a few ships in the world that can lay this, and they're remarkable machines in their own right, where it takes weeks to wind on the cable to go across an ocean into one of these ships. This is kind of part way through. It takes a long time to wind it up, and then the ship crosses the ocean, gradually unraveling it and winding it down. And it doesn't just plump it in the sea. You get these devices periodically every 60, 70 kilometers. And these serve a couple of purposes. One is they amplify the light so that it finally makes it to the air and sort of bright enough to be reliably detected. And that's why there's copper in there as well to provide DC power going through it. And it's even designed so that if one of the copper links breaks, it can use the salt water of the sea as a backup conductor to keep it going until it's repaired. But they also contain a controlled amount of air, so it can control how buoyant it is. And the ships go out, they know exactly where they are on the surface of the sea. They have a very precise topographic map of where on the sea bed the cable is going to go. And they put in the right amount of air to which the devices to control where it is. For example, if there's a trench, they know ahead of time whether they're going to lay the cable down to follow the trench border, or just lay it across and have it buoyant enough to stride across. And depending on where you are in the ocean, you're going to choose one of those options. So remarkable things in their own right, but you finally get across the other end and you have an undersea cable. But if you're a given user of the internet, say, suppose, I don't know, say it's your job to do the railway signaling for the UK. Well, you're going to want to have redundant links between different points in your network to send it off. You might request that from a network provider, but what are you going to get? It's not uncommon to have two redundant paths that actually end up as two wavelengths of light on the same strand of glass. So you're technically resilient in terms of, if a laser just burns, then you've got another one. But in the most common failure case, which is someone digging up the road and cutting that fiber, both paths will fail. You could have optical redundancy where you have two fibers, but they end up in the same cable duct. Or you might even not know where your cable ducts literally are. They could end up being separate on your map, but they could be maybe some path of road or railway or something where they end up being almost next to each other. And again, the same failure can impact both of them. So this is a big problem where there's still, in some sense, an open problem to how much can we actually use clever software to kind of infer all these common mode failures and know them ahead of time or mitigate them. But some of it also just requires kind of hard work of going out and figuring out where all these things are. So that's the kind of physical infrastructure side. And again, it ends up being less resilient than you might imagine. For example, you go to the right spot in Cornwall, you could take out a big swathe. There are like 4 buildings in London, which are not particularly massive secrets, where again, if you were to take out those 4 buildings, you would take out a large fraction of the UK's internet capability. So that's one side of her to kind of worry about. And as with all these things, the trade-off in engineering it is it's like there's no one person in charge of the internet in the UK, right? It's all these individual people, be there for profit networks or for other things like Janet. They're making their own decisions, and no one's there saying, "Hang on, everyone's making the same decision here. We should separate out a bit." And until there is a major problem, the imperative is usually to do the thing that's most cost-effective, and there's a tension there between being the most resilient. So that's the physical side. I'll talk about one of these core routers now. Now, as you say, these machines, so these are sitting out on the internet. These, imagine, big box, lots of optical fibers coming in and out of it. It's full of custom silicon to forward the packets, custom optics and lasers to kind of turn those packets into modulation of light so it gets across the fiber to the far end that it's talking to. And we have CPUs and everything. We have loads of complex software to make it all work and talk to the peer routers and make sure everything works. And so this, amongst other things, this is a really big computer just sitting on the internet. Like if you were to take your laptop and just plug it in the internet without a firewall, probably within minutes it would be attacked successfully. The internet is a very bleak place to be sitting there as a computer with a TCP stack. The moment you come on, you will be attacked and people will try to find known vulnerabilities. And to say these things are bigger than any other router, they're bigger than any firewall. You can't protect it with something else. It has to stand alone. Let's say any regular computer sitting on the internet is very vulnerable from either just an implosion of data, that means whatever it's trying to do is just kind of swamped out by this flood of other data coming in. There could be attacks on the kernel. So if it's running Linux or Mac OS or Windows, a packet that's designed to attack a security issue in the code in the kernel, that means the whole computer falls over, or maybe an application vulnerability. So it goes through the kernel into a particular application, but then the packet's been crafted to exploit a problem in the code there and cause that to either fall over or worse, kind of be taken over and do bad things. And so we have this problem. The core routers have to sit there, but we need them to be indestructible. How do we do that? Well, again, I'll just give a flavour of the sort of thing that we can do. And as with the TCAMS, the underlying theme here is sort of compatible with this sort of famous quote from Alan Kay, which is people who are serious about software should make their own hardware. And indeed, we are serious about software. And as a result, we do need to craft the definition of the hardware in which it runs to both manage just the throughput and the problem space to be able to do this, but also the security. So again, this is just one example of the sort of thing that we have to do. If we look abstractly at what it means to be called what's called a network stack, which is the whole set of software on, say, your phone or your laptop that is the code that touches data as it comes in and out of your laptop through the Wi-Fi connection or the cellular connection on your phone or a wired Ethernet connection. You can abstractly look at it like this. So there's some hardware at the bottom, be that like a Wi-Fi radio or a cellular radio or an Ethernet like physical RJ45 connector, into which like packets actually arrive via lasers or modulations in the air or something. And there's some chip, there's some set of hardware that'll actually receive the packets, check they're not just corrupted, and do some basic classification of them. And then normally it'll pass them on through some queues into the kernel. So again, if you're running a phone running Android or iOS, it's the code in there in the kernel, where, for example, it will know about the outside Ethernet encapsulation, and then depending on what sort of packet it is, which are lots of different sorts, it will sort of pass that packet on to another stage for processing. So you end up with kind of this sort of graph of packet processing as each individual packet sort of gets subdivided into a particular use case. And finally, if it's intended for an application, be that kind of internal one like DNS or an application you're running like say Spotify or a browser, and maybe each tab has its own process, the kernel will sort of send the data for that thing through there. So that's in abstract kind of what the software for handling packets looks like on a device. And think, well, what could go wrong? Well, if we just kind of abstract out, one example would just be, well, there are all these points where we're sending packets from sort of an input source, like the hardware, to a receiving source, or maybe, and it's always possible that these two things have different capacities. So in particular, maybe the hardware can send packets into your operating system at, say, I don't know, 10 gigabits per second. But if you really send a full 10 gigabits per second of traffic there, that would actually overwhelm the code here and something bad will happen. And that can happen logically at any point where there's a differential in the processing capability. Another thing could be, well, if you send like a bad packet, you could cause the process to crash. And then if it's a user space process, well, it'd be restarted and you carry on. Like, so it's kind of not the end of the world. If that happens in the kernel space, though, if there's a vulnerability in how it reads the metadata of the packet and it's been coded to be, or is accidentally kind of a bad packet, well, then again, you get undefined behavior within the kernel, which means your whole device is up for grabs, and that's a bad situation. So how can we possibly like mitigate this? Well, again, in abstract, this is kind of one thing you can do. We're going to put more stuff in the hardware, and the hardware is essentially silicon that's been designed to be able to handle the full rate of packets coming in that could ever be consumed by the hardware. So in our case, for like a core router, that's like many tens of terabits per second. But when a packet comes in for a router, one of the first checks that happens, well, is this router actually intended to be processed by the router itself, or is it just flowing through like a river? And most of the traffic is just flowing through it. Only a tiny fraction is actually intended for consumption by the device itself. Normally things like either other peer routers talking to it about how it views the network, or some central automation talking to it to like manage it as a device. So most traffic just flows straight out through the specialized silicon and optics and never actually touches a general purpose CPU. But of the dribble of traffic normally there kind of goes, it is destined for the router itself. In the hardware, we can look at what's called the microflows. We know exactly, for example, which particular conversations have been validated and authenticated as valid uses of the router hardware. Like, for example, if, for example, you SSH into the router to get like a shell, once you've authenticated, it knows precisely who the endpoint is and what the source and destination IP address and ports are and everything, and it can validate that and allow that through. Anything else that's not been authenticated can get policed down to a very small dribble. And then you can have separate queues that go through, and we're going to skip the kernel entirely because we don't want to affect the entire device. And then go through to, again, a sort of a user space packet processing graph, where it's similar to what happened in the kernel, but we're doing it all in user space, which is both high performance and means actually if there is any bug, for example, that causes a crash, well, then we can restart just one part of it and keep the whole router going and we haven't torn ourselves down. And so does this make us indestructible? Well, it means we can engineer certain guarantees because we know, well, literally how much data can flow into the device because there's only so many like plug holes that can take so many packets per second. If we can engineer around that, and we can characterize our software by how many, for example, packets per second any one point in the processing graph can safely take, and just make sure that we always engineer it so that there's never any overwhelming stage. We can take away entirely the kernel stage. We can make every part modular and restartable. And in fact, we developed a kind of we've open sourced the software framework that we developed for processing packets at super high rates in software. So you go to fd.io, you can see that and use it if you want. So there's complexities, but that's kind of one insight to how by combining a hardware software engineering approach and by doing kind of lots of careful software engineering, where in our high performance framework example, we're doing things like prefetching cache lines, and measuring clock cycles and doing very sort of techniques from high performance computing to make sure we can cope. So that's again an insight of how we can even sort of dare to take on this challenge of stick our devices out there unprotected on the internet and hope that they can kind of look after themselves. And indeed, historically, they've done pretty well. So I'll now talk about just a few past disasters and then leave time for Q&A if you have them, and if not, we can get some time back. So people in everyday discourse quite often say the internet has crashed. What they usually mean is that the particular thing that they care about has gone down in a very localized form. Like, for example, very often their Wi-Fi router or their particular service provider is having a problem with their area of town at that moment. But if you take away those, then how often have we had actually a major systemic problem with the overall connectivity of the internet, right? Not one site, not one DNS provider, but with the pure packet forwarding guts of the internet. How often has that actually collapsed? Well, there has been at least one internet-wide disaster documented from 1980. So that's when it was back in the ARPANET. You can read all about it in document RFC 789, which lasted a few hours and essentially reduced the throughput to basically unusable. There was another one of the first worms, called the Morris worm, effectively killed the internet by saturating all the links with traffic that wasn't useful. If you find old timers and feed them enough incentive at the bar, there are other outages that have happened in these early networks that again, similar to Sean Gorm's thesis, have been documented and then classified, so even they're not allowed to read about it. And they're often fascinating if you can get to talk about it. But again, these were they predate the time when the consumer internet was really a thing. Not in the internet, but in the phone network. There have been examples of what's called cascading failures. And this is that kind of show us the sort of failure that you really want to avoid. Because if you imagine, let's say there's just a bad packet, if you send it to a router, will cause it to die and need sort of restarting manually. Okay, that's really bad. But what's much worse is if first it forwards that bad packet to all its friends and then falls over, because then you get this cascading effect, and it could take out, in principle, the entire internet if one packet can take out all the different forms of the routers on there. And that's the sort of thing that happened in AT&T's long distance network. Again, that was phone switches, not routers, but again showed the sort of thing to worry about. And for single network failures, like one big network. So, for example, back when AOL was one of the major networks in the world, there have been outages that take out. Pardon me. That take out one entire big network have happened occasionally. But even these errors, again, usually affect one network rather than the entire internet. They've almost always been due to errors, not malice. That's due to mistake rather than someone actually trying to do something bad. And you see this in the uptime statistics. So it's sort of a well-known observation for people who run big networks that, for example, if you look at how often the graphs of like how much of their network is impacted by a problem. Like you'd like it to be 0%, but usually there's always something happening and some fraction of the users have some problem. Those graphs always look better over holidays when all the operators are at home, apart from some minimal sort of 24/7 support, and nobody's messing with it. It's when people actually evolving the network to grow it, add new services, add more capacity. It's that where it's the people and process errors and configuration errors where most outages really occur. And so when there's a problem, a lot of speculation online rapidly turns to things like anonymous, oh, there must be some massive hack going on. And from my perspective on the inside, often helping these big networks get around these issues, that's, in my experience, that's almost never been the case. The vast majority of cases where there's an outage is because of just a bug or a mistake, or just a problem, rather than some actively intended bad outcome. And there are many of these. So again, you can just go through problems. One particularly notable one for me is the particular code base that we work on was responsible for one problem with the outage, where there was a bug in how the software handled a protocol, and for the entire history of the internet up to that point, the data that people actually used had a certain property, and then one day it didn't, and that caused a bug that actually that hit a large number of routers simultaneously. So that took out a large part of the internet. But that's not the only thing that can go wrong. So recall that the point of a packet network is that all the routers are talking to each other all the time about what the state of the network is, what links are up, what links are down, so that when a packet comes in, suppose I'm a router in London and a packet comes in destined for Seattle, I know which way to send it down of the fibers that are connected to me is best going to get that packet one stop further along to its eventual destination, Seattle. So all the routers are talking to each other all the time about what the best way is that's available to get to every destination on the internet. Well, there's very little say preventing a router saying, well, actually, you know, for example, YouTube, I've got the best route on the internet to YouTube. Send all YouTube stuff to me. And all the routers say, okay, well, that's the quickest way to get to YouTube. I'm going to send it to you. And that indeed is what happened with Pakistan Telecom's routers for a couple of hours before YouTube found a mitigation. So for this time, Pakistan Telecom's routers announced that the best way to YouTube was via them. All the YouTube requests in the world kind of went to them, and then there was a problem. What did they do with this superpower? They turned every video into Rick Astley. They didn't really. It just dropped the packet. But if we go back in time, that'd be possibly the funniest thing to do with that particular outage. But more seriously, it reveals the fact there's kind of vulnerability. Well, how if a router, some random router on the internet that's controlled by somebody else, tells you, oh, they're a really good route for something else, should you believe them? What are you supposed to do? How can you evaluate that announcement? So there's gradually been more effort put into cryptographic attestation of the validity of that kind of announcement. If some router in some far-off land says, oh, I'm a really good price for a given service, should you believe them? But it's a slow process to get there because it is this collective action problem. If I'm running my network locally, it's a complicated thing to try to put all this cryptographic stuff in. It's probably going to cause mistakes and cause my customers to have outages. And if I do it, what will I see? Not a lot. So it takes time for the incentives to align before people actually do this. But there is movement now in this. But there's still a lot of these mishaps today. And put mishaps in quotes because it's often not clear whether these things are accidents or malicious. And again, based on experience before, we'd expect most of them to be accidents. But also, the stakes now are clearly so high, they'd also expect some of them not to be accidents. So you can see things where various countries around the world have sort of sucked in traffic via this way. There have been some analyses of particular nation states sort of developing the capability to do this for when they need to do it in an adversarial situation. You can turn it into money, where, for example, not a nation state, but just a band of crooks actually stole Amazon traffic for 2 hours, and they did that in order to steal cryptocurrency, and they just made money out of it. And so all the sort of annoying, criminally minded, or worse sort of people in the world are looking at this now with an eye that's with a much more clear-eyed view of what can they do for their own advantage, even if it spoils it for everyone else. And so it's clear now that the capability to address all these concerns, be it physical infrastructure, routing security, software security, all these things about how the internet's glued together. Many entities, be they nation-state level adversaries or just well-resourced bands of crooks, are systematically developing the ability to probe these and, when necessary, unleash these. And historically, we haven't had a lot of these that are serious enough to warrant a really big investment in everyone in this collective action situation, taking the steps required to inoculate themselves against this side of attack. So we are in a somewhat precarious situation right now. You can see the upside in situations like Ukraine, for example, where at the start of the Russia invasion, Russia did unleash a very serious cyber attack on Ukraine at the start of the invasion. You don't really hear about it very much because Ukraine has been under cyber attack from Russia for quite a long time. And they've developed systems and resilience methods whereby they can adapt and fall back on alternative things. And so even though there was quite serious cyber attack there, they managed to mitigate it with multiple approaches that they've evolved over the various years of having Russia banging on their door. So it's clearly possible. It's just there's an incentive problem to aligning it. And from our point of view, we need to be doing everything we can to basically put the software in place so that to do what we can to address this. So to kind of conclude, how breakable is the internet? How soundly should we sleep about all this? Well, it's more breakable than we really want it to be. And as I say, back when the internet was kind of a bit of an academic experiment that didn't matter so much. But of course, these days, people live their lives, they run their businesses, they learn, they fall in love, they run their lives on the internet. So the stakes are becoming ever higher. And so from our perspective, we have loads of software engineering problems to try to solve this and keep the internet up for everyone and grow a bigger and cheaper internet for all. And the historical very bad outages have only affected a small fraction of the internet for a small fraction of ours. And so they've really been done by accident. And when you're versus bad luck, that's kind of what we had so far with non-critical internet usage. As I say, the dependence on internet, the criticality of the internet is going up over time. And we are now getting well-resourced adversaries who are preparing serious abilities to do that. So we have a lot of work to do. And so that's kind of where I'm going to leave it. Just one quick note, if this kind of thing interests you, we are hiring. You can see here from my particular team, the Ensoft team dealing with this sort of this big network side of it. You can go to these two URLs here, CS.co Ensoft, the easiest one to go to, or jobs.cisco.com shows all roles across the UK. So I'll leave it there and see if there's any questions.
Yeah, I was going to say thank you very much, Simon. We don't have any yet, but I think we'll leave it open for another minute or two. See if anyone has anything. In the meantime, just a big thank you for your time for going through this. I mean, it's been super helpful. I don't know how many people were here expecting Kim Kardashian, as you say, but hopefully for those that both were and weren't, they still found it very useful. So there were some good examples in there, and yeah, I didn't necessarily expect to see Rick Astley pop up either, so it was a pleasant surprise. Cool. There don't seem to be too many questions rolling through at the minute. I think, like I say at the start, we have our Discord server. If anyone does have anything, I think a lot of people will probably watch it back, so we can let Simon know if there's anything that comes in. So don't be afraid to join Discord and ask. But yeah, a big thank you to you, Simon, for getting involved, and have a great day, everyone. Thank you for joining.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers. Bye bye.